Does it feel like every part of your life is divided? Every scenario, every environment, your church, your school, your work, your friends, left, right, conservative, liberal, religious, secular. It seems you always have to take a side. This is a conversation between a progressive Christian and a conservative atheist who happen to be great friends. Welcome to Living on Common Ground.
Do you think if we met today, we would still be friends?
I don't know, but we're friends now.
A mob is known as a mob because they're with you.
Man, so what? We won a few games. And y'all fools think that's something? Man, that ain't nothing, y'all. And you know what else? We ain't nothing either. Yeah, we came together in camp. Cool. But then we're right back here and the world tells us that they don't want us to be together. We fall apart like we ain't a damn bit of nothing, man.
For this week's episode, Lucas and I had the opportunity to sit down with Mark Charles. Mark is the author of the book Unsettling Truths. Subtitle is The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. Mark is a speaker, he's a writer, a consultant, and he's the leading advocate for the conciliation between the Native American population and the United States. Mark is a dual citizen of the United States and the Navajo Nation. He has appeared on PBS NewsHour, on CNN, Esquire, The Guardian, Voice of America, and the recently released documentary Bad Indian, Hiding Out in Antelope Canyon. And he's been on other shows and publications. If you want to learn more about the work Mark is doing, you can listen to his podcast, My Second Cup of Coffee. You can also check out his website, which is wirelesshogan, all one word, .com. We'll have that link in our description for the episode. You can also watch his TED Talk called The Truth Behind We the People, and you can find that on YouTube. I hope you enjoy this week's conversation. Well, thank you for joining us today, Mark. I greatly appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
So I've watched several of YouTube videos. I've got a copy of your book. A friend of mine actually gave it to me a couple years ago. He was on his way to a conference, and he has an autographed copy of the book, and he lent it to me. And then I had ended up just kind of keeping it, and he wanted it back because it had your autograph, and so I went ahead and purchased my own. And But yeah, watching on YouTube and also listening in different podcasts, I know that you often begin by acknowledging the land that you're on. And I didn't know if you wanted to do that.
Yeah, I like to just introduce myself traditionally wherever I go. So if I can do that for a moment. Yate, Mark Charles Yinashia, Tsin Bake Dene Nishle, Doto Higlini Bashichin, Tsin Bake Dene Dasher Chader Totachini Dashanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our four clans. We're matrilineal as a people. Our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Tsin Bake Dene Nishle. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the Wooden Shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsin Bake Dene. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totachitni, which is the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I live in Washington, D.C. now. I moved here from the Navajo Nation about 10 years ago, so I'm a dual citizen of the United States and the Navajo Nation. And the land where I'm living today, my people call it Washington. It's Washington, D.C. The host people of these lands are the Piscataway. They're the nation that they were living here and hunting here, farming here, fishing here, raising their families here, and burying their dead here long before Columbus got lost at sea. and they're still here. So I acknowledge the Piscataway as the hosts of the land where I'm living. I thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just remind myself and all of us that anywhere we are on Turtle Island, we are on indigenous lands. And it's important to remember that there is a story to these lands that pre-exist our history books and even many people's own experiences on these lands. So that's how I like to do that wherever I go, whenever I speak publicly, both as a Navajo man as well as to acknowledge the people whose land I'm speaking on or I'm speaking from.
I'm interested, how does it, the citizenship of the Navajo people, how does that work? What does that mean that you have dual citizenship?
So I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. We have our own president. We have our own tribal council. We have our own land. We have our own police force. We have our own court system. We are a nation. We were a nation long before Europeans immigrated here. And we weren't organized formally as a tribe or the way we are today, but we were a people with a language and a culture and a history and a background. And it was through the process of assimilation, both through the removing us from traditional lands and putting us on reservations, and then setting up tribal government, which is what the U.S. did for Native nations all around the country. I literally am a citizen of the Navajo Nation. Traditionally, that's signified by my 4 clans. All right. I introduce myself through my 4 clans. We're matrilineal, so it goes through our mothers. But then also just politically or whatever, citizen-wise, I am a citizen. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I have rights and privileges there that come from being a part of the Navajo Nation. And I am a dual citizen. I'm a citizen of the United States. So I was born within the continental United States. It was in the, early 1900s, I think the Citizenship Act made all Native Americans citizens of the United States. So my grandparents, my great-grandparents became citizens. And so, I'm a full citizen of the United States, but I also acknowledge that that's not my only identity or citizenship. I'm also a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I'm Diné of the Navajo people.
What does Diné mean?
Diné literally means it's the people.
Oh, okay.
As compared to the animals or the four-legged.
That's interesting.
But it's how we refer to ourselves. Not over and above other groups of people, but just how we refer to ourselves as the people in our creation stories and in our relationships with the emergence through our 4 traditional mountains and onto our lands. So Navajo is a Spanish term. So we were colonized by the Spanish before we were colonized by the Americans. And so a lot of our Navajo language or words, not language, but a lot of our words come from the Spanish. Navajo, I think it can mean those who stole our fields. But it also, like we use the word peso for money. Obviously, that's very close to peso. Yeah. in the Spanish language, we'll use other words borrowed from the Spanish language that we made into Navajo for things that we may not have had or concepts we may not have had prior to the colonization. So it was we were fighting the conquistadors and the Spanish coming up from the south long before we were fighting the Americans coming from the east.
Right. Is there a word? I'm curious. Is there a word for that's for your people group that is not Spanish based? Then, is there another word that's not? Because you said Navajo is a Spanish, comes from the Spanish word. Was that originally the tribe?
So we would call ourselves Diné.
That would be.
We would call ourselves Diné.
Okay.
So
that's interesting.
The Navajo came. So
that's really interesting.
So we actually have some shared heritage. You and I do. I am the Dutch side of that, the American. I'm 3rd generation. My grandfather and my grandmother both were originally from or were the firstborn here in the United States. And it's not often that I meet someone who also has the Christian Reformed background. And I tell people that here in Tennessee, and they have no idea what I'm talking about.
No.
So, yeah. Interesting.
Although you just got a major faculty member at Belmont University from the Christian Reformed Church.
Really? Who's that?
Yeah, John Whibley.
Okay.
Who ran the Worship Institute at Calvin for decades.
Yeah.
He and his wife just moved down, and they're both working for Belmont now in Nashville.
Yeah, my mom went to Calvin.
Okay.
Yeah. Her options for college were Calvin or Calvin. Like that was all that were the two. That anyone at that generation of my family, that's where you had to go.
Yeah.
And so anyway, but that brings me to this, the thing you're doing right now, which is the Common Memory Tour. Because while we may have common background, it doesn't necessarily mean common memory, does it?
No.
Okay. So do you want to explain some more of that?
So, the first thing we need, so the common memory isn't really where I start my teaching.
Okay, sure.
I'm one of the leading experts in the nation. Not the only, there's many other people who know a lot about this topic, but I'm one of the few people who have an expertise in what's called the Doctrine of Discovery.
Yeah, that'd be a better place to start then.
So the Doctrine of Discovery, it's a series of papal bulls, edicts of the Catholic Church. It says things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever land you find not ruled by white European Christian male rulers, those people are less than human and their land are yours to take. So that's the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people because they didn't see them as human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was literally lost at sea, land in this new world, we call it Turtle Island, and claim to have discovered it. Right? The first sentence of the first chapter of my book, Unsettling Truths, says you cannot discover lands that are already inhabited. You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize lands, but you can't discover them unless your worldview, or better yet, your church, informs you that the people already living there aren't human. So that doctrine becomes the basis for the land grab throughout North America. The Charter of New England, right? All of these are based on this doctrine of discovery. The Revolutionary War was basically a war between the colonies here fighting for the right of discovery to these lands that the crown in England claimed for itself. So the colonists, that's the Declaration of Independence is basically the colonists saying, we want the right of discovery. We want to be able to control the appropriations of lands here. You're rising up violence from the merciless Indian savages who live here. And so they were fighting for the right of discovery to these lands. And when the war concluded, they were signing the treaty in Europe, and there weren't even any natives present at that signing, right? I mean, it was our land they were fighting over, and we weren't even a part of the negotiations of what happened after that war concluded. And so what most people are not aware of is how deeply embedded into not only our history and our founding documents, but into our psyche as citizens of the United States, how deeply embedded this bias of the doctrine of discovery is that's there. And so this has, as I mentioned earlier, it affects things like our Declaration of Independence that says things like all men are created equal, but then 30 lines later calls natives savages. Our Constitution, which starts with words like we the people, but Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women, specifically excludes natives, counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. 1987, or 1887, if you take away women, you take away natives, you take away black people, you're literally left with white men. And technically you had to be a landowner to vote, right? So we the people literally means white landowning men. I mean, that's who this document was written for. And we've never corrected that. We've never changed it. If you read the Constitution today, you'll find, if you start in the preamble, go to the 27th Amendment, you'll find to this day there are still 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his, littered throughout the document. Who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by the document. It wasn't written to protect women or people of color or Native peoples, to include us. And so this has had a huge impact on how we conduct business and how we govern ourselves and all of the things about as a nation. Most Americans think we've abolished slavery. They think, Abraham Lincoln abolished slavery. Well, if you read the 13th Amendment, that's not what it says. It says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, whereas the party has been duly convicted shall exist. Slavery is not abolished. It's just redefined and codified under the jurisdiction of our criminal justice system. This is the same criminal justice system that to this day has the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world and incarcerates people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate at which it incarcerates white people. And so this is the challenge, right? Two of the most difficult chapters to read in our book, Unsettling Truths, is chapters 9 and 10. 9 and 10 deal with the adage that says the victors write the history, which no one really disagrees with, right? If you win a war, you get to write about the war. But we speculate in that chapter, given the fact that the victors write the history, had Nazi Germany won World War II, how would their historians have recorded the history of the legacy of Adolf Hitler? Well, he'd be their greatest leader ever, right? Brought them from global obscurity to global dominance. Had Nazi Germany won World War II, how would their historians have recorded the Holocaust? We have Holocaust deniers today. Imagine if they won the war, right? What Holocaust? There wasn't a Holocaust. What makes chapters 9 and 10 of our book so challenging is we take that adage and we go by the observation that the United States has never lost a war that matters. We've never been disarmed. We've never had a regime change. We've never given up large tracts of land. We've never borne the scorn of the global community. We've never lost a war that matters. Technically, the Korean War is still going on. Yes, we pulled out of Vietnam. We pulled out of Afghanistan, but we didn't lose any lands there. We've won every major conflict we've ever been in militarily. As a result, we, and by we, I mean white landowning men, have been able to write their own history for 250 years, even longer if you go back before the Constitution. And so, understanding that, we take a hard look at Abraham Lincoln, who most people in this country would say is one of our greatest presidents, right? The Republicans love to remind us that they are the party of Lincoln. When our first Black president was sworn into office, he put his hand on the Lincoln Bible, right? Both parties love to claim Lincoln. But when you read the writings of Lincoln, he was, till the day he died, a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist who introduced himself in 1858 by saying he had no intention of meeting voters. Our voters are jurors of Black people. He had no intention to let them hold office or to intermarry with white people. He said there's a difference between the Black and white races, which he believed would ever forbid the two from living in terms of social and political equality. And as long as they did remain together, there had to be the distinction between superior and inferior. And he, as much as any other man, believed in the superior position of the white race. Right? That was his quote when he introduced himself nationally in the Lincoln-Douglas debate. And so as president, he had a challenge because he wanted to end chattel slavery, not because he believed in the equality of Black people, because it was a black eye for white people. But he didn't know what to do with Black people once they were freed. So he debated everything. Does he send them back to Africa? Does he create a new country for them? He had no intention of making them full citizens of this country. And he decided on, well, let's just keep slavery legal in prison. So a black judge, or a white judge, a white jury, a white law enforcement officer, on a whim, can arrest them, remove their civil rights, and put them in the one place where slavery is still legal, which is in our prison system. Mm-hmm. And so, right, and I haven't even started talking yet about how during his presidency he went through and systematically ethnically cleansed the northern, central, and southern routes of the Transcontinental Railway. Mm-hmm. With things like the Long Walk for the Navajo, the hanging of the Dakota 38 in the Dakota lands, the removal of the Dakota and Winnebago from Minnesota, the Bear River Massacre of the Cheyenne of the Shoshone in northern Utah and southern Idaho, and the Sand Creek Massacre of the Cheyenne and Arapaho in eastern Colorado. Like literally ethnically cleansing the northern, central, southern routes of the railway. And then 8 days after the last of those ethnic cleansings, declaring essentially that we're going to complete manifest destiny. So this is again, this is the history we don't talk about, right? Mm-hmm. We talk about how Abraham Lincoln held our country together. We talk about how Abraham Lincoln freed Black people and abolished slavery. But he actually didn't do that. He redefined and codified slavery. He gave us many of the tools we're using today to oppress people of color. He did not believe in the equality of the Black race and the white race, and never even pretended to believe that. And I would rule him as one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history in regards to Native peoples. And so this is where, I mean, that's just one example.
Do you think even more than Jackson? Or do you think that he's on par with Jackson?
I would actually put him as worse. And the reason for that is because twice during those genocidal campaigns he was doing, he paused and he called for a national day of Thanksgiving, asking the country to give thanks to their God for the fruits of the genocide, the land, the acquisition of land, the acquisition of minerals, gold, silver, and coal. That was the direct fruit of the genocide he was committing. Mm. So he's literally pausing in the midst of these genocidal campaigns, calling for a national day of Thanksgiving and saying, let's give thanks to God for the things we're acquiring from these savages that we're defeating across the continent.
And were those campaigns? Because I'm not familiar with those. I'll have to read more about that. Were those campaigns? Was the ostensible reason for those campaigns to further war aims for for transportation and because you were talking about the railroad?
They were literally, so when you put those four campaigns, the Dakota 38 and the removal of the Dakota Winnebago from Minnesota, the Sand Creek Massacre and the Bear River Massacre, mm-hmm. And the Long Walk for the Navajo Mescalero Apache, when you put them on a map, and I do this in the talks I give, they're literally right along the pathway. In fact, the Bear River Massacre took place a stone's throw from where the Golden Spike was eventually laid, connecting the eastern and western routes of the railroad.
Okay.
I mean, it's very clear what he was doing. And after he finished the last one in 1864, 8 days later in his annual address, he said, "Yeah, we're gonna complete this. We're gonna complete."
It's for the Intercontinental Railroad to clear the space for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's. It's once you see on a map, once you read the language of what he did, and so even if you look at our treaty, the treaty of my people, the Navajo people, mm-hmm. we're removed. We reside mostly in the Four Corners area, maybe as far south as like Gallup, New Mexico, as far east as Grants, New Mexico, as far west as Flagstaff, Arizona, and up into southern Utah and southern Colorado, those where our four sacred mountains are. We're removed from those lands through the Long Walk, and brought to what can only be described as a death camp in eastern Colorado, mm-hmm. where many of our people were killed in this death camp. And when you read the treaty that we were forced to sign to bring us back out of that death camp, it literally stated that we would not oppose the building of railroads through our land.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was the goal.
Sure.
They're removing us, and the southern route of the railway, right? Right now there's a railroad going right through. You can get on the Amtrak at Chicago, go down through Denver to Albuquerque, and go right through Gallup, New Mexico, Grant, New Mexico, Gallup, New Mexico, Flagstaff, Arizona, and come out near Los Angeles, right along that railway that they were trying to build. And that's why they had to remove us, so that they could claim those lands and then build the railway, which is why our treaty said we would not oppose the building of railroads, right, because that was the entire goal of the campaign in the first place.
Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting.
So yeah, it's a very disturbing history, because we don't know what to do with it, right? We don't know how to talk about. I mean, at the end of those chapters, I can literally make a direct comparison between Adolf Hitler and Abraham Lincoln. Primary difference between these two gentlemen is technology. But the systemic nature of how they're trying to ethically cleanse these lands is very similar. In fact, Hitler got many of his ideas from what the U.S. did to Native peoples. And so, but we don't like that comparison, because our notion of we're God's chosen people, we're exceptional, we have a unique relationship with the divine, right? Our notion of manifest destiny tells us that we're the good guys.
Well, and Hitler is our generation's boogeyman also. And I don't mean that he was okay. That's not what I'm saying. But he is.
Yeah.
We don't believe in the devil anymore, right? But we believe in Hitler. Like every generation has to have the absolute worst, in the same way that it has to have the absolute ideal. And I think it's interesting that you're comparing these two. And I would say not only technology is a difference between them, but also one of them won the war and one of them lost the war.
That's the whole point of those chapters, is we draw that very clearly. We actually look at the comparison between a guy named Oscar Groening and Robert McNamara, both clogs in World War II, not even engaged in military involvement. Oscar Groening worked for the German military. Yeah. He was a soldier. He was an accountant stationed at Auschwitz. His job was to make an accounting of what they were stealing from the Jews and pass it up the chain of command. Robert McNamara was an analyst for the Navy under General LeMay, and he was analyzing bombing raids and trying to figure out ways to more effectively bomb people. Germany lost the war, and when Oscar Groening was speaking out against the denial of the Holocaust that people were doing in Germany, he gave an interview to the BBC and talked about his role in Auschwitz, what he saw, what he was opposed to, what he wanted to be transferred out of and asked for transfer out of. And he was arrested and charged with accessory to 300,000 murders and was found guilty and died a condemned war criminal. Meanwhile, Robert McNamara, who admitted in the documentary The Fog of War, he agreed with General LeMay, who said, if we lose this war, we're all going to be tried as war criminals. And McNamara agreed and said, I agree with him. He's right. We were acting as war criminals.
Well,
but he was given the some other award, and then went on to become the Secretary of Defense, and he's celebrated. And the only difference between the two is one side won and the other side lost.
I mean,
the side that lost became a war criminal. The side that won became a war criminal.
Well, he got his reputation got tarnished a bit after Vietnam, to be sure. But I definitely understand your point. And there's no doubt that I mean, as far as I'm concerned, one of the worst things that happened, and this is going to sound wrong, one of the worst things that was done to further war aims was the firebombing campaigns. They're just unbelievably brutal. And yeah, I know that quote from LeMay that, we better win this thing because it's going to be bad for us if we don't.
And Nagasaki and Hiroshima were not even the worst of it.
Right.
The worst was the Operation Meeting House, the bombing of Tokyo.
Yeah,
which we chose because it was a wooden city, right? Hiroshima had 70,000 dead. Nagasaki had 40,000. Tokyo had 100,000.
Right. Yeah.
And yeah. So this is, I on my second cup of coffee, a podcast I do on a weekly basis. Just last week, because it just was a month. It was earlier this month, August 6th and 9th, were the anniversaries of those bombings in Japan. And very little was said about it this year. And so on my second cup of coffee, I addressed those two directly and linked the mindset of why we did those bombings to the mindset of why we ethnically cleansed Turtle Island.
Well, and I do wonder. I'm sorry, Jeff. I know you want to.
No. Go ahead. I was just going to bring up Dresden. Dresden is one of those that a lot of Americans had never heard of. And I thought about that because I thought about when Lucas, you had mentioned that you had not heard about some of the genocide that Mark, you were talking about earlier that Lincoln oversaw in order to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. And that made me think about this idea of a common memory, is that we are all living the same history, but we don't have the shared memory of it. Yeah. Is that kind of the point of the common memory? And I think it was George Erasmus, right? Isn't that the quote that you share?
So yeah, so the quote then, and I use this quote in the book, I use it in my speaking, I use it in my call at the end of my TEDx talk for National Dialogue on Race, Gender, and Class, where I use the quote. It doesn't come from George Erasmus. It was a quote he used when he was writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. And the quote goes, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community, you need to start by creating common memory." And the reason I think that quote is so important is because, first of all, there's no point in U.S. history where we can look back and say, oh, remember when we had healthy community across racial or gender lines, right? That point doesn't exist. The history has always been worse. And second, it's when you look at our racial history and our gender history, right? There is no common memory. We have a white majority that remembers the mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color that have the lived experience of stolen lands, broken treaties, enslavement, Jim Crow laws, segregation, mass incarceration, boarding schools, internment camps, families being ripped apart at our borders. There's no common memory. And understanding that quote, of course we have horrible community, right? Of course, the chaos we're living in right now exists because we've never wrestled with our history at a meaningful level. And we've never found a way to acknowledge that history. Mm-hmm. And which is why in chapter 11 of our book, Unsettling Truths, I look specifically at the role that I would say trauma plays in keeping that history unaddressed.
Explain more about that.
So when I say trauma, most people immediately think of what's called PTSD, mm-hmm. post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder. It's an individual diagnosis for someone who's experienced a horrifying event, right? It affects you mentally, physically, emotionally, relationally. It's kind of this all-encompassing condition. There's another trauma that is another form of PTSD that's more multi-generational. It doesn't occur from a single event. It comes from a series of events. So if you can get PTSD from being in a battle, you can get what's called complex PTSD from living in a war zone. If you can get PTSD from being abused, you can get complex PTSD from living in an abusive relationship. And psychologists don't know how it happens, but they observe the symptoms of a complex PTSD in the children and grandchildren of the parents of the people who experienced it. And then there's a third trauma called historical trauma, which is not an individual diagnosis. It's actually how psychologists deal with the dissatisfaction that exists in broad communities. It was first observed in Native communities after our history of boarding schools and removals. You can also see it in African American communities after segregation or enslavement or Jim Crow laws. You can see it in Jewish communities after the Holocaust, or in Japanese American communities after internment camps. I refer to historical trauma as a multi-generational communal manifestation of a complex PTSD. And the first symptom of trauma is shock and denial, right? So you don't know how to reconcile what happened, and so you go into shock and you're in denial about it. You don't want to face it or to deal with it. And so when I go out and speak, I have to be very aware of the PTSD, the complex PTSD, and the historical trauma that are present often at the same time within my audience, especially people of color who are on the receiving end of this history. But the most disruptive demographic in my audiences that I've encountered is not people of color, but it's white people. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't understand why they would be so disruptive and even in denial about what we did as a nation or why we did or what we did. And I was trying to understand, and I came across this book she's now a friend of mine. Her name is Rachel McNair. And she was investigating, she's a psychologist. She was investigating what she calls the psychology of killing. And she wanted to know what happens when society gives you the right to take a life. You're a police officer, you're in law enforcement, you're a soldier, you're a drone pilot, you're in certain aspects of the medical field, and you have the right or the ability to take a life. She wanted to know, what does that do to you psychologically? And she found that it causes what she labeled a perpetration-induced traumatic stress, or PITS. PITS, she concluded, has all the same symptomatology of PTSD, except PITS afflicts the perpetrator, whereas PTSD afflicts the victim. And so once I found her research on PITS at an individual level, then I could hypothesize or at least speculate if PTSD has a multi-generational communal manifestation at a complex level that is seen and observable in communities of color, might not PITS also have a multi-generational communal manifestation at a complex level, which is the trauma I've observed afflicting my white audiences, who are absolutely at times in denial about their history, have no clue how to talk about it, and will do anything they can and cause any amount of disruption or distraction to make sure those conversations get shut down. And so I prepare for the breadth of my audience, not just my people of color, but even my white audiences, as I'm dealing with another group of traumatized people. And I found when I treat my white audiences not as fragile, which is when you read the book White Fragility, right? That's what labels white as fragile. And not as oppressors, right? Not as white supremacists, which is the other category white people get put into immediately. But when I first and foremost deal with my white audiences as traumatized by the actions they're standing on and the benefits they're enjoying, and I treat them as traumatized, not explaining or excusing their behavior, but understanding their reaction to their behavior, I found I can do a much better job of engaging a healthy, even productive dialogue that includes my white audiences, where when we treat them as fragile, the white audience has nothing to add to that conversation. If white people are fragile or they're racist, they have no role in the conversation because they have to be protected from it or they're an aggressor in the dialogue. But if I understand first and foremost that they're coming into it traumatized, then that creates a space where they can, in a healthy way, engage within the conversation. And so I work very hard to understand the multi-levels of trauma that exist within our national demographic and prepare for my audiences trying to be aware of all of those levels of trauma so that I can try to find a way to have a broad conversation, create this common memory around this history, which is absolutely horrifying, right? I'm not going to pretend this history is good in any way. It's a horrifying history, but we need to learn how to talk about it.
Is there, in your estimation, is there any group that is not traumatized then? Or is your contention then that all groups are traumatized in some way, either as victim or oppressor?
So the three audiences that I deal with most directly, right, is when we look at the history of the United States, which the history of the United States began with the discovery, right, the Doctrine of Discovery, the discovery of these lands by European nations, and the enslavement of African people. And so that brought in people from Africa, right? They were kidnapped from Africa. They were shipped here by boat and then enslaved here and forced to build up this country. Native peoples who we were living here long before Columbus got lost, had society here, had trade here, had treaties here, had relationships, right? We were here. And we were seen as savages. We weren't human. And so they saw this land as empty, so they discovered it. And so when you look at our nations, even the way we talk about things, like politicians especially love to talk about the United States as a nation of immigrants. And the interesting thing about that dialogue is what that does is it erases the two groups who have a crucial role in our history, but have been dehumanized, right? If we call ourselves a nation of immigrants, that excludes Black people because they didn't immigrate here. They were kidnapped and brought here and enslaved. And it excludes Native peoples who were already living here, were indigenous to these lands. We were just not seen as human. And so even that national discourse is like trying to negate the two demographics that are most problematic within our history. Now, right, when you deal with other immigrants, and so the challenges in my work, I found that the definition of whiteness it's fluid in some ways. What is white today was not white 200 years ago. But as groups have come in and as they've established themselves and they've been able to be added into what we call this definition of whiteness, whether it's the Irish or whether it's, other groups of people who have come here, it's been some expansion of that understanding. But I bring these things back to, these are the three core demographics that we need to learn how to talk about that history. Obviously, we have to learn how to talk about what's happening now with immigrants coming up from Mexico, and our relationship with Canada. And I mean, there's a lot of problems. If there's another great book that was written by Daniel Amirwar, it's called How to Hide an Empire. If you've never read this book, I highly recommend it. It talks about the way, if Unsettling Truths, the book I co-authored, talks about the way our foundings were in colonization and colonialism. How to Hide an Empire talks about how that empire building has been both extended and hidden through the 20th century, even into our modern history.
So we got into it late and couldn't do it in the way that the UK could, that the British people could. You had to pretend you weren't doing it. I'm sorry to do this, but I really want to hear. So, is there anybody in this conversation that you would consider to not be traumatized? Then, I'm really interested in this idea that maybe the problem is that everyone's traumatized. Whether you're in these, you know what I mean? Is there can you imagine a scenario in which there would be a group of people that wouldn't be traumatized that would be part of that conversation, or is everyone traumatized? And so that needs to be kind of the foundation when we're having this conversation.
Well, so I treat that as the foundation. Okay. I don't know if I would say exclusively everyone's traumatized, but I treat everyone in that category. And I say this when I speak, right? I tell people, I actually don't care for the purpose of this dialogue whether your ancestors came over on the Mayflower or whether you jumped a fence last week, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. Yeah. You came here to benefit from the stealing of land and the theft of labor from Native peoples and Black people.
Mm.
And so it's going to be hard you can't participate in this dialogue as if you're an innocent bystander on the outside, right? And so there may be less history, but, you've still come here because, the United States of America has done a very good job of selling itself as, hey, we found this empty land and you can come and create your dream here, right? They promoted that for centuries. And that's not true. The reason there's an American dream is because they found lands that were occupied, ethnically cleansed, dehumanized, and stole it from the people who were living here, and then got another group of people to build it up for them. And yeah, when you do that, you're going to make a ton of profit, right? You're going to prosper in some unimaginable ways. And so that's the story that's sold. Hey, we found a way to prosper. Well, and so again, it doesn't matter if you came here with the Mayflower or jumped a fence last week. If you came here to live a better life, you still came largely and you didn't seek the permission, right? If you sought first and foremost the permission of the U.S. government, which has no right to do anything regarding immigration because they have no treaties. They have nothing that says they actually have the right to the land here. All they have, which is why in my TEDx talk, I point out the doctrine of discovery when it comes to land titles is referenced as precedent as recently as 2005.
Yeah, I was going to bring that one up, Mark.
I mean, that's what's so challenging is because if you want to talk about what gives legitimacy to the U.S. stakeholders in land here, it doesn't go back to a treaty. They won't even go back to a war. It goes back to a doctrine of discovery that says this land was empty and God gave it to us. And so that there's no legal standing there, obviously. And so this country right now is illegitimately trying to control immigration over lands it stole. And the reason it's getting paranoid is, right, if you have a friend who steals cars, what are they scared of most? That their car's being stolen. If you have a friend who's cheating on their significant other, what are they paranoid about? That their significant other's cheating on them. Why? Because they know how easy it is to do, right? So when you have a nation that's built on domestic terrorism and ethnic cleansing and all the stuff we've done, what are they most afraid of? The very things we're acting out afraid of, paranoid about today.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And so, so this is why I think it's so important that we go back and build this common memory. I'm not trying to cancel people. I'm not trying to even demonize people. I'm saying if we don't find a way to talk about what we've done as a nation, and then find some way to resolve it, we're just going to continue to spiral until we are, you could already say we're out of control. And we were out of control long before Trump got into office. Trust me. He's just the latest iteration of all of this. But yeah, we have not been in control as a country in a very long time. We have never known how to wrestle with our history. And we've never known what to do with our value for equality, but our history and foundations that don't want, acknowledge, or even work towards those things at all.
Yeah,
and that's why the common memory, and that's why the work that I'm doing, I think, is so important.
Well, you brought up the 2005. That's the city of Sherrill versus the Oneida Indian Nation of New York.
Yeah.
Until I watched your TEDx talk, The Truth Behind We the People, I'd never even heard of that. And so I thought that was really interesting too. And that in order to overturn all the different judgments, they ended up referencing back to the Doctrine of Discovery, which I thought that was really interesting or sad. To be honest with you, it was disturbing to think that just 20 years ago that was something. Because to sit and listen to it about in history, that's one thing, but then to see how it's continually still being applied is a completely different conversation, I think. So one of the questions I have as we kind of move towards our wrapping up our time with you, which again I greatly appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Yeah.
But so you're trying to create a conversation, right? And then you talk about it being on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, Rwanda, and Canada. And then you talk about, but it's not really reconciliation as much as it is conciliation. Okay, so that was a long way of me getting to my question.
Yeah.
How do you get people to the table when there are groups of people that still benefit from just ignoring the history?
Yeah. So there's several ways that I think we can get people to this table. First of all, colonialism is bankrupt, right? It's not sustainable, and it leads to bankruptcy, and it can't continue indefinitely. Just like capitalism, right? It's not. You can't have unlimited growth. That's called cancer. At some point, you need to learn how to live within reason and within a range, and you need to learn how to control your urges and not just have this unprecedented, unlimited amount of growth. And you have to learn how to live within a sustainable world, live sustainably within a world that has limited resources. And so one of the things that I do in my work is the nation talks endlessly about power. And power is defined as having the ability to act, right? So you have money, you have resources, you have weapons, you can accomplish, you have the ability to act. Authority is defined as the right of jurisdiction, or you might want to say the permission to act. Now, a day doesn't go by when politicians will talk about how powerful we are. We have the most powerful military in the world. The history, we have, there's not a day that doesn't go by where Wall Street doesn't remind us we have the most powerful financial system we've ever built. We talk a lot about power. Even our churches talk a lot about power. We almost never talk about authority. Why? Because we don't have any. Again, you want to talk about land titles. Legally, that conversation goes back to a doctrine of discovery. Not even a treaty. We're not even willing to claim we fought a genocidal war and took this land. We take it back to a theology, a writing of a church. And so we have no authority. Or the authority we claim is a myth or a fallacy. And yet the United States really wants to have legitimacy here, right? They stole the Black Hills. We, as a nation, the United States stole the Black Hills from the Lakota people. And we carved the faces of some of our most genocidal presidents on them. Later, we felt bad about that, so we offered to buy the hills from the Lakota people. The Lakota people said, those hills aren't for sale. You can give them back, but they're not for sale. There is literally, to this day, $1 billion plus sitting in a trust fund the Lakota refuse to touch because their Black Hills are not for sale. This country wants legitimacy. Why do you think Trump is renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America? He wants something in this area that why does he want his face on Mount Rushmore, right? He wants to be legitimate in these lands. And you can't build legitimacy on theft. And so, as a Native person, I and our Native community had something that this nation can't steal, they can't construct, they can't conquer. And that's legitimacy here. Stories, a history. And if this nation wants that kind of legitimacy in this land, the only way they can get it is through relationships and through treaty with Native nations and Native peoples. And so this is where, right, if I'm going to engage in this struggle that we're in, and I'm going to treat it as a struggle for power, I'm going to lose. Because the U.S. they have enough power to destroy the world and everything in it. Mm-hmm. They have way too much power. I'm not going to win a power struggle with the United States of America. But if I can make this struggle about authority, about relationship, then I have something, and the Native community has something that this country, this colonizing nation desperately wants, but has no access to, no matter how powerful they are. And so the goal behind my work is not just how do I overcome this, it's how do I change the struggle from a struggle about power to a struggle about authority, from talking less about the ability to act and more about the jurisdiction or the permission to act. And that's what I'm doing with my work right now. And that actually includes an invitation. One of the stories I've used this for over 20 years now. I've used it around the globe to engage dialogue between colonial nations and indigenous peoples. When people ask me, and I've been asked numerous times, how does it feel, especially when I lived back on the Navajo Nation, we were there for 11 years, and people would say, Mark, how does it feel to live on a reservation in the middle of the United States of America? And I said, it feels like our Native communities are this old grandmother who has a very large and very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they violently locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. They've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to our bedroom, but it's much later. We're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts the most, the thing that causes the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house. Now, many people will say, Mr. Charles, that's absurd. How can a thank you possibly bring resolution to what's happened? Well, thank you doesn't bring resolution. What a thank you does is it flips the paradigm. Now, instead of talking about victim versus oppressor, we can start talking about what I think is the real problem in our dynamic, which is that we have a white majority who's never asked for, never been granted, never received permission to be here. And they're running around acting like they own the place. And we have Native peoples who are indigenous to these lands who have been pushed aside onto reservations, into the margins, and treated as unwanted guests in someone else's house. What I want to do is I want to invite the majority population to understand in some very real and practical ways they are guests in someone else's house. And I want my indigenous and our native peoples to understand in some very real and practical ways, we are the host people of the land. And I want our guests to act like guests, and I want our hosts to act like hosts. And that is not going to solve the problem in and of itself, but that's going to flip the paradigm enough where we can now start talking about the real challenges and the real problems we're facing, and actually have the ability to hear some very different and possibly better solutions of how do we move this thing forward. That's why I say, let's start with creating common memory. And that's why I say we don't need to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The challenge with reconciliation is it perpetuates the myth.
Mm-hmm.
Reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony, which is not true. This relationship began violently and chaotically. And so we're not restoring a previous harmony. We need not racial reconciliation. We need racial conciliation. We have to mediate this dispute for the very first time so that we might possibly be able to build a healthy relationship moving forward.
Well, I appreciate that. So real quick, you're working on a book right now called Decolonizing Faith. When do you think that'll be out?
I am writing that book currently. It's a bit behind schedule. My first goal was to have it completed by the end of the year, the draft written. That's an aggressive schedule to make. I still would love to see it come out late 2026, early 2027.
Okay.
And that book really wrestles with a lot of the violence that exists within the scriptures of the Bible. And how do you wrestle with that violence?
Oh, interesting.
And then I'm writing a third book as well called Decolonizing Health.
Okay.
In the last 2.5 years, I've radically changed my health personally.
Mm-hmm.
I've lost over 60 pounds. I've changed my movement, my breathing, my sleeping, my everything, my diet. And the way I've been able to do that is whenever you read a book on health, right? There's tons of books out there. Every author has their one thing. Eat this or don't eat that, or do this or don't do that. And they're not entirely wrong, but they're not entirely right either. And you have to filter it.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've realized, what I've learned, a very beneficial filter is how were indigenous peoples living prior to colonization? What were my Navajo people, what were other native nations doing prior to colonization? And using that as my filter. And as I've been able to do that, but also adapt it and incorporate it for a modern world, I've radically changed my health. And so I'm writing a book, and this is another fruit of the Doctrine of Discovery. When you come into a land and you think it's empty because the people here are savages, obviously there's nothing they have to offer you, nothing you can learn from them. So you never bothered to ask, how do you live here well? Well, had they bothered to ask, they would have learned, right? One of the foundations of our chronically ill health is our corn-based diet, right? And all the things that does to us. We, as Native peoples, we've been eating a corn-based diet long before white people got here. We cultivated corn for the first time here. We introduced corn to the world. We've been eating corn, and we have ways to cook it and prepare and to eat it that doesn't destroy your health. But they never bothered to ask. And so this book is really, I'm calling it Decolonizing Health, because I'm trying to help you understand that not only has colonization had a radical impact, negative impact on our politics, which is what Unsettling Truths says, as well as on our faith, which is what Decolonizing Faith talks about, but it also has a radically negative impact on our health, which affects each of us personally. And so I'm actually hoping this third book will be the book that has the broadest audience and then brings people into the discussion that has to include the faith and the politics. But I think the health is going to be the thing that might get the most people into the room.
Well, I wish you the best of luck in your work. I think you've got a lot of challenges that you're gonna face, but I really appreciate the perspective change. I think that was something that is very helpful for me to be able to get my mind around about how to proceed, because when I first became aware of what you were trying to do, I was like, this is such a huge thing. I wouldn't even know where to start having this conversation. So I do appreciate sort of the switching from power to authority. I really enjoyed that. Thanks.
Yeah, and I appreciate your questions. You're willing to engage with this. I love the conversation we had about trauma. And I think, at least in my own work, once I understood the way trauma affected nearly every participant in this dialogue, my ability to engage the dialogue increased exponentially.
Yeah.
When I was unaware of that trauma, I would trigger my audiences, not even knowing what I was doing, and not knowing how to respond to their reactions. And the more I understood the role that trauma played, both for the victim as well as the perpetrator, the better I was able to engage those conversations across both those audiences.
Yeah, that's great insight. You got any other questions, Lucas?
Good. Thank you so much, Mark, for your time.
We greatly appreciate it. I will send you an email, a link to the episode when it comes out in the next couple of weeks, okay?
Great. Right. Thank you so much. And I appreciate both of you.
Right.
So
thank you, Mark.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Living on Common Ground. Please follow wherever you listen to your podcasts and share it with your friends. You can also find a link to our social in the description. The more people we have living on common ground, the better the world will be.